Chapter 29. July was a scorcher in ways we couldn't have imagined. The air was hot and suffocating, a wavy wall of thick heat that made it hard to breathe. It felt like putting one's face over an open flame. Crops withered and died. Hapless birds rushed into dark houses and barns, breaking their necks. Even in the shade, it was a piping 110 degrees. We spent those super hot days in the loom, trying not to faint while spinning thread. The wavy hot air brought bad news that lay suspended in the haze. Buildings were combusting. A series of fires lit up the state. Half of downtown Dallas went up in flames, and 40 miles away in Denton, too. Not to mention Pilot Point, Ladonia, Milford, Sulphur Springs, Fort Worth, Honey Grove, and Waxahachie. All over the course of one long weekend. We heard the Lucys talking about it, this alphabet of fire spreading like a song. In a matter of days, culprits were named. The first, newfangled prairie matches. One man said he saw a whole box burst into flames before his very eyes. Another theory soon emerged in the tense shadow of scorched buildings. A coerced confession from a slave near Creel Miller's farm, outside Dallas, became a siren call. A new vigilance committee was formed, and every Negro near Miller's farm was interrogated until the right answers were given, and the full view of a conspiratorial plot began to unfurl under a dense white sky. Men we knew who ran the drays long distances, hauling cotton and timber and wheat, told us what they heard at the mills and the ports. Some were even interrogated and beaten, accused of collusion in a great plot with northern abolitionists who aimed to destroy the state by fire and make way for insurrection. We asked them more questions, but they were unwilling to tell us more, warning us how quickly word was spreading from county to county, how they could barely do their hauls without constant checks of their passes, how often they were relieved of their tools. "Don't repeat what I say here," a drayman would say to one of us. "Of course not," we'd lie. It wasn't a big lie because we'd only tell one another, under the tree where we still gathered sometimes, and in the dark, looking up at the web of branches under the moon, we'd piece together these bits until a strange thread emerged, a new panic spreading like the flu. Junie had no choice. This time, she'd have to use the cotton root to make Lizzie's tea. It seemed likely that Lizzie might complain about the difference in taste, but she could make something up about how this new ingredient was important at this stage. She set it boiling in the cookhouse and asked Sarah to keep an eye on it, as she knew the girl wouldn't press her and would simply do what she was told. During the morning meal break, she removed it from the heat and let it cool. Once the temperature had lessened, she strained the liquid and poured it into a small pitcher before carrying it into Lucy's house. She knocked on the bedroom door where Lizzie was rushing around, packing some of Carol's things, diapers, booties, rag bibs. Junie set the small pitcher on the table, as she had done nearly every day for the last 2 weeks. "This batch may taste a bit different. Boiled it longer this time." A quizzical look spread across Lizzie's face. Junie felt her legs stiffen, her mouth now dry. She wasn't sure she had answers ready for whatever questions were coming. Lizzie went over to the pitcher and peered down inside it. She leaned over and sniffed, scrunching up her nose. She rose and gave Junie a pointed look. Junie froze. Any day now, she was sure the white woman would turn on her. Lizzie would gag on the vile liquid and accuse her of trying to poison her. If not that, then later, when the tea worked, the woman would grow regretful and have her strung up for murder. And if the remedy didn't take, she'd be a liar, a godless root worker who tried to contaminate the woman's mind against Christ, and whatever burden the child became would somehow fall upon Junie's shoulders. Every day, she pushed these scenarios from her mind, forced herself to only picture the large boat rocking precariously down a narrow river. Only the hazy vision of her children kept her feet moving, her mouth lying, a stack of lies so tall she worried they'd soon topple over. "I told you I'm supposed to go to the Suttons for Emmeline's lying in," Lizzie said. "But maybe I'll just send word that I don't feel up to it. It can't be safe traveling right now." Lizzie sat down for a moment. She drank a few sips of the liquid. "Ugh! It doesn't get better, does it?" There was a loud crash in the front room of the house, followed by Harlow bellowing loudly and the front door slamming. Junie couldn't decipher what he had been yelling, but it jolted Lizzie to her feet, muttering under her breath. "Probably won't be back from the Suttons until tomorrow, so I'll need more than that," Lizzie said, her eyes on the bedroom door. "That's all I got now." Lizzie rifled through the drawers. "No matter, I guess. I couldn't travel with all that liquid no way. Just bring me the clippings and I'll boil them myself while I'm over there." Junie felt stunned, like time had sped up and she was trying to catch up to it. "Don't just stand there. Go get him. The Suttons' wagon will be here soon." Her mind spun for an excuse, but Lizzie just waved her away. Junie left the room and went out of the house. Her options were few. She could ignore the ask and just return to the fields, or risk giving Lizzie what she requested, a risk that seemed less perilous the more she thought about it. The bigger question was another missed dose. While Junie may not have fully understood the workings of plants and how they affected the body, the one thing she knew for certain was that consistency was key. Like prayer, like tending crops, like raising animals, little worked without regular repetition. She went to the cookhouse, where a sack of the roots lay hidden underneath the table. She had planned to soak another batch for Lizzie's next dose, but now she wondered what was the danger in handing some clippings over. It's not like Lizzie knew what they were by sight. Of all the tasks Lizzie supervised or tackled with her own hands, the planting of cotton wasn't one of them. Lizzie might know something about cooking or sewing, weaving or canning, and sure, a few times a year she wandered down to a weigh-in and watched the seed cotton be sacked and measured, before being taken over to a neighbor's gin. Maybe she had even observed Harlow bringing in new seeds, opening pouches of the latest breeds to try. But from the house where she spent most of her days, they were only visible in full bloom. Without the wispy white heads or the spiky hard receptacles that attached them to reedy stalks, they looked like most anything else, like any twig littering the forest floor. And so, Junie wrapped a portion of the roots in a rag, after checking them first for any telltale signs, any remnants of the bowl or the head, making sure it looked like nothing more than kindling. She made a tight fist-sized bundle and took them into the house, where she placed them next to Carol's diapers. Lizzie nodded and went back to trying to iron the wrinkles out of her best dress. The Suttons' dim, cool house should have felt like a respite to Lizzie. More than a handful of women were there already, some gossiping over iced tea and lemonade, while others tended to Emmeline, sweating and uncomfortable in a thin nightgown. The women moved easily from bedroom to parlor and back again, while two house girls brought in iced water and coffee, hot water and towels. Emmeline had in the galley a midwife and a doctor at her service. The doctor was some Harvard-educated thin wisp of a man who barely looked old enough to shave, while the midwife was a stocky older German woman with a thick accent and a collapsible chair she carried from room to room, as if it would disappear the moment it left her sight. While Lizzie should have felt relieved to sit in the parlor, sipping ice water under the vigorous fanning of an adolescent house girl, all she felt was a familiar jealousy even she was tired of. She swirled the cool glass, marveling at the fantastic clinking sound the ice made and the cold shards that lay alive on her tongue. Emmeline still had ice, in this heat. Of course, the Suttons had their own ice house, but after a month of this weather, she couldn't fathom how they managed to keep anything frozen. If the house girl had leaned over and said a magical fairy delivered it, Lizzie would have believed her. Carol squirmed in her lap, sucking from a cold, wet towel, but the child didn't scream. Even if she did, the Suttons were prepared for that eventuality. A wet nurse was on standby. Emmeline's sister assured Lizzie when she first arrived. "Ready whenever you need," the sister sang, as Carol bucked and shrieked in Lizzie's arms. Lizzie stretched her lips wide in the appearance of a smile, but once she was led into the breezy parlor and offered a seat next to a mountain of pastries on a silver tray, she decided then that she would spend most of the lying in opposite that fanning house girl, instead of near Emmeline's swampy bedside. Lizzie told herself it was because of the smugness on the sister's face, but in truth, she walked in with the intention to do as little as possible. She had no interest in propping up Emmeline in one uncomfortable position after another, while the woman panted and heaved in her face. She didn't want to mop down Emmeline's sweaty limbs with a fresh washcloth, or offer middling advice about bearing pains, or any of the other 100 tasks women came to do with these affairs. She could hear them now, down the hallway, a rising nervous chatter that permeated the house like the drone of a beehive. It wasn't a selective group of women. Any woman nearby was invited, and probably a handful more than usual, as it was expected that some would be too fearful to make the trip. She let herself doze off, only waking when the other women began filing into the parlor and taking seats alongside her. The doctor had chased them out of the bedroom, complaining about how he couldn't do his job with a bunch of meddling biddies in the way. "You shouldn't have come," he told them. If they were upset in the moment, they were no longer. Now, in front of Lizzie, they mocked him, his flustered, blushing face, how he was downy like a baby, a veritable coating of blonde fuzz on his face and neck, how he asked them to help Emmeline back into her clothes instead of the sheer nightgown she was in when he arrived. "Modesty is of the utmost importance," he told them, before stepping outside and fastening a long white cloth around his neck. "What'd he need that bib for?" a brown-haired woman asked the group. "Decency. He's supposed to touch without looking, you know." A few of the women tittered. "Well, he is a child. I declare I got girdles older than him. He probably never even seen one up close, just them scary drawings and dust through textbooks. Fancy college or not, I do think it's improper. Some strange man that ain't her husband down there rooting around." Another woman nodded vigorously. "And wasn't it a school way up north? Don't seem like Sutton to let some strange northerner in his house, let alone mess with his wife. You sound like those nuts in Dallas. You must not read the papers." "I read plenty. Since when every Yankee John Brown? Ran that last cobbler out of town over an accident of birth. I paid him good money to fix my best pair of boots, and now I'll never get them back or the cash I gave him." "Ladies, I do think we have a bona fide abolitionist in our midst," a blonde woman said, letting out a low whistle. "You take that back, Amelia." A loud cough from above interrupted the growing hubbub. The doctor stood in the doorway. "Would one of you ladies mind coming in for a spell? It's not proper for me to be alone with Mrs. Sutton." No one moved, as everyone was eager to see how the two women would resolve what was now fraught and heavy between them. "Go on, Lizzie," another woman piped up. "You've been hiding out here all afternoon." All eyes turned to Lizzie, and she directed her gaze to Carol, asleep on the floor, a blanket spread out underneath her. "She's fine. We'll call you if she wakes up." The intensity of their pointed gaze pushed Lizzie to her feet, and she nodded, suddenly wanting nothing more than to get away from them all. She followed the doctor to the bedroom. Lizzie made a horrible witness. She sat in the corner with her face turned away most of the time. She didn't talk to Emmeline much, didn't hold her hand or mop the sweat away from her face. She didn't even watch the doctor really, stiff and kneeling, one hand wandering around under a puddle of fabric with Emmeline turned on her side, so the two didn't have to look at each other. In between questions, he rambled on, about the weather and heat, about a new mill being erected in the county, a stream of inane conversation, about building materials, pine, white oak, cottonwood, and the rumor of a coming railroad, while the woman grunted and panted, sometimes crying out in pain. Lizzie couldn't keep her thoughts together, and she made an excuse to escape, to send another woman in to take her place. He nodded, and she sprang up and bounded toward the door. For a moment, she was ashamed that she couldn't even hold up her end of the bargain. She should at least be able to play the role, to dither and help and gossip and sew, or even better, to get closer, to assist the man, to unleash a stream of chatter that might assuage the redness in his face and loosen up some free medical advice. Was she bypassing an opportunity to solve her most urgent problem? The ice water and cooling fans were just a bonus. What she really needed was some medical know-how. Whatever Junie had given her wasn't working. There were moments where she felt grateful, as she knew this time everything would be easier. Sarah would wean hers early, and she'd finally have a wet nurse of her own for as long as she needed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was too soon. She was still apprehensive, though she felt like she shouldn't be. After all, there were women she knew who had a baby every 18 months, like clockwork. But she didn't feel like she had the constitution for it. After 4 deliveries, her body already seemed so different. There were all kinds of changes she didn't know how to explain or who even to explain them to. The women in the parlor still felt too far away for that. It was at these times she missed her mother and sisters most. Were these strange fatigues and fevers common? Was it normal to have a bladder that leaked like a sieve, or seemed to hold no more than the smallest cup of water? Or for her uterus to slide so low, she swore she could feel it peeking out when she peed? Not to mention her breasts. She feared another babe barreling through would split her in half. Some days the fear was muscular, so much so that when Charles moved against her at night, her whole body snapped shut. She sucked in some air and settled herself back on the chair. Dr. Colson. He shushed her, fumbling with his pocket watch, Emmeline crying out in great pain again. Ah, that's it. About 7 minutes apart, it seems. Oh, I can keep time for you. Lizzie gave him a weak smile and offered her hand. He gave her the watch, and she moved her chair a bit closer to the bed. With a bit of delicacy, she moved the conversation ever closer to points of relevance. Never mind about the pine and white oak of the new mill, or the precise probable location of the railroad post. Instead, how long had he been man-midwifing? And if a woman did find herself caught, but she worried her constitution was too weak from the last birth, was there something she could do to stave it off a while? Weren't there such methods? Midwives said there were, but he must know better than them old grannies and such. A learned man of science such as himself, more astute, with more knowledge in his left foot than all of them put together. He blushed, but this time, a different kind of blushing. He puffed his chest out, wiped his damp hands on a rag, and looked her in the eye. Midwives can't do what we do. They're all right in a pinch, I suppose. But if there's a breach or a more complicated matter, they aren't much use. I had this case once, he leaned toward her now, where the uterus closed around the fetus like a vice. Everything stopped. The patient was in labor. I could hear her whenever I stepped outside to talk to her husband. But soon as I came back in, the uterus tightened like a tobacco plug. What's an old midwife going to do with that? But you see, I got a whole bag of tools at my disposal. He leaned over and pulled out a metal tool with a twisted head. He dropped his voice to a whisper. I had to pry her open like a walnut. But after that, smooth sailing. Baby came right on out. Lizzie couldn't remove her eyes from that metal tool. How much it resembled cutlery, something used to carve a slice of ham. She felt her body grow heavy, and she sat back firmly onto the chair, as if it was threatening to slide out from underneath her. It's all a matter of balance. Midwives don't understand that, he went on. The 4 humors, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood, are the keys to good health, and in females, restoring the menses will solve most problems. Its disappearance is a telltale sign of imbalance. The human body is more complicated than we realize, I always say. More delicate, too. He turned back to Emmeline, who was breathing heavily, her eyes shut tight. What time is it? He asked Lizzie. Lizzie shook her head, counting. 8 minutes? That can't be right. She handed back the watch and stood up. He was still fiddling with it when she moved toward the door. Need a break? Send in another, won't you? He hollered as she pulled the door shut behind her. The hive energy of the women was farther down the hall. Lizzie turned and went the opposite way, back out the front door. It was dark now, but the moon was bright. It was still unearthly hot, a gust of heat smacking her in the face. The German midwife, who was sitting in a rocker, jumped up as Lizzie stepped onto the porch. She was short, with unruly gray hair she wore tucked in a loose bun. The collapsible chair leaned against the front of the house. It's just me, Lizzie said, waving the woman to sit back down. The midwife settled back into the rocker, smoothing down her long skirt. How is she? All right, I guess. She'd probably feel better if you were in there. The midwife shook her head. With him? Her bottom lip turned into a nasty sneer. Nine dunker. Lizzie sat down in a rocker next to the midwife. She wants me, but husband wants flashy doctor. He win. Lizzie laughed. That sounds familiar. For a long moment they were quiet in the dark of the porch, watching the wind shift the dry, shriveled stalks of what was left of the Suttons' garden. It was even more haunting in the dark, the loose pale sprigs waving like bony figures from the beyond. Dogs howled, followed by shouting and whistling. Both women sat up on the edge of their chairs. The patrol was out, circling the area. She pushing yet? The midwife asked. No, seemed like the bearing pains were getting further apart. Huh. I may have got the timing mixed up, though. No, you're right. I've been listening the whole time. The midwife knocked on the wall behind the 2 rockers. When your countrymen are quiet, I can hear her just fine. She pulled a folded cloth out of her pocket and unraveled it in her lap, revealing a tangle of dry, reedy twigs. What's that? Cotton roots. It speeds up the bearing pains. Oh, like from a cottonwood tree? The midwife shook her head. No, from the crop. If you find yourself troubled and you need to bring on the Red King, it works for that too. She separated a fistful of twigs out and wrapped up the rest, sticking the remainder back in her pocket. Lizzie cocked her head to the side and stared. The midwife laughed at the look on Lizzie's face. I hear the Schwarzer swear by it. All the time, they chew and chew. It's a wonder y'all have any left. She stood up and moved closer to the house. She's too quiet. But Lizzie wasn't listening. She was still following the bundle of twigs in the midwife's fist, her mind spinning a million incoherent thoughts. In a rush, she had tucked the clippings Junie had given her in a sack with Carol's clothes. Maybe here was a better solution. The midwife pulled open the door. Wait, Lizzie said. Can I have a little of the cotton root? The midwife nodded. Once I get Mrs. Sutton on her way, you can have whatever's left. A picture was forming in Lizzie's mind, but it didn't crystallize until hours later. Until after the midwife had muscled the baffled doctor out and reinstated the party of women. After Emmeline squatted on the collapsible chair, a half-moon cut out of its base, her sister holding one arm, the blonde woman holding the other. A slimy head emerged from the fleshy opening and into the midwife's ready hands. An audible cheer went up in the room. Lizzie watched it all, disinterested in the corner, waiting for the moment when the tangle of roots would be handed over to her. Once Emmeline was cleaned up and the bedding changed, the baby cleaned and dressed, the bundle of twigs was finally hers. She thanked the midwife and slipped off to the empty parlor, where she opened the bundle and compared them against the clippings Junie had given her. They were identical in color and slimness, plus similar indentations and discolorations where the limbs had been broken off. She stuck one of the bony twigs from the midwife into her mouth and chewed it, as if it were a delicious dessert she had been waiting for all day. She chewed it, over and over, until the tough stem broke down into a soft, grainy pulp, then spit the mass into her hand. The smell that wafted from it was musky and slightly nauseating. She did this again with a twig from the tangle Junie had given her. They tasted the same, smelled the same. And more than that, she couldn't shake how familiar the scent was. Sarah smelled like that, as did Patience and Lulu. Junie sometimes, but not all the time. She assumed it was a shared bodily odor among them, some mixture of sweat and soil. With her tongue, she could feel a chalky film covering her teeth. She scraped a front tooth with her fingernail, and buried underneath was a yellow substance. She moved closer to the table, where she pulled the pitcher and plates off the tin tray, and then held up the tray to look at her reflection. She opened her mouth wide and saw her teeth speckled with yellow grit. The tray slipped from her hands. That speckle of yellow grit, that too was familiar. A strange interaction in the yard one summer. She had seen Sarah outside, hanging the family's laundry, and she had caught the girl chewing yellow clay. She remembered the girl had said it was to stave off hunger, and she never forgot it, because the answer always unnerved her. Sure, she could write off pica as just another childish trait of the people she and her husband owned. Another way they were fit for their place in the world and she hers. But, in a sea of red balance sheets, the pica said something more about she and Harlow and the enterprise they were running. That not only were they a small farm with fewer than 10 slaves to their names, but those few people were so poorly fed that they chewed on dirt and clay to satiate their hunger. She would have happily given the girl 20 lashes for stealing food from the cookhouse without looking into it any further. But this wasn't neat in the same way, and she hated that. It stung, another piece of evidence of their mounting failure. That old feeling washed over her, and it wasn't fair to say it was old. It was always there, a shadow in the corner, a fly drowning in the cream. She had barely moved, a portion of her face visible in the silver tray, crooked on the table. She picked it up and walked outside with it. With both hands, she hoisted it low between her knees and flung it out toward the dead garden among the waving dead tendrils. It fell to the ground with a sharp clanging thud, a glorious sound. She had the mind to walk home, but there was Carol, and the moon had moved. It was darker now, too dangerous to walk. She'd have to wait till morning. She turned back to the house, just as Emmeline's sister appeared in the doorway, wide-eyed, a shotgun in her arms. Emmeline's sister lowered the weapon when she saw Lizzie. "You all right? What was that?" Lizzie turned to look at the woman standing on the porch, the Suttons' large Greek Revival-style house towering against the dark sky, its paint so white it looked illuminated. "Nothing," Lizzie said slowly. "I just came out for some air and knocked something over. Come on back in. It's not safe." Lizzie nodded and followed Emmeline's sister inside. She went back into the room, where Emmeline and most of the women were asleep. 2 women sat in the corner, whispering and sewing. "Where's the midwife?" Lizzie asked. "Back in the kitchen, I think. Come on, we saved you a space next to Carol. She was an angel. Does she normally sleep that long?" Lizzie didn't answer. She scrunched down next to Carol, balling a blanket underneath her head. If she had thought she would be getting any sleep, she would have complained. She would have extracted Carol from the mess of doting sleeping women and moved to the parlor. Instead, she just lay down. She needed the hive energy of the women to counteract what was congealing in her mind. The years in Texas, the non-existent birth rate, the book of names that went nearly unchanged from year to year without additions or increase, the needed wet nurse, how the only surviving children came from her womb. They all knew that myth of a plantation overrun with pickaninnies, fruitful mothers with litters of children. She had the plumb opposite, and for years it plagued her, and now she knew why. For so long she wondered if they had been cursed, the fruitless soil, the perpetual bad weather, from strange freezes to hellish droughts, not to mention the death of young William. But all along there had been another reason for their mounting failure. Why, the answer had laid itself out before her so plainly, and she'd do with it what any Old Testament god worth his salt would do. Rain down hellfire until the angel saw fit to intervene. Chapter 30. The next morning, a hazy fog greeted us. We welcomed it, thinking it might finally be the end of this perilous heat wave. Rain was finally on its way, we figured. The whole of Texas had been waiting on such rain for 2 months at least. All morning we worked slow, trying to salvage what corn we could, sniffing the air for sign of a storm. The salvaging was a fool's errand, as most of the corn was withered and desiccated, but we tried anyway. For the first time in a long time, we were out there all together, with Nan and big-bellied Sarah among us, trying to squeeze a full day of farm work into the few tolerable hours of daylight, while Monroe and Isaac were off with Harlow on an errand. We weren't out there long before the fog burned off and the sun's gaze grew in intensity. "Come on, Patience, make it rain now," Sarah teased. "That ain't what I said." "You didn't deny it," Nan added. We laughed, all except Junie, who just nodded, with a small closed-mouth smile. The air grew warmer, a hot wind barreling through, clogging our noses and making it harder to breathe. The sun bore down harder, a seething, inescapable eye. We traded straw hats, draped our aprons around our heads and necks, but the sun and wind pushed in anyway, stinging our eyes, erupting in heat rashes up and down our arms and backs. When we were done, with barely a bushel to show for the effort, we trudged over to the loom, where we'd normally spend the hottest portion of the day spinning. But it was padlocked. The riverbed near it was waterless, just a winding bed of pale stones. Stiff-legged and parched, we headed back to the quarters, but the well over there was barricaded now, covered over with a flat piece of wood and a large block of stone we couldn't move. Something was surely awry, but we couldn't think past our thirst or the tingling heat engulfing our limbs. We plodded to the cookhouse, but the mile-long walk felt thrice as long, and by the time we reached the doorway to the small dark building, heat sickness failed us all. We stumbled in, dizzy, so beset with headaches and stomach cramps, we could barely move. Patience, Lulu, and Junie were sweating profusely, wiping their faces and necks with the damp sleeves of their blouses, while Sarah and Nan complained of feeling dried out, so flushed with heat their insides felt aflame. On the floor, we laid out, grateful to escape the sun. We passed around a small tin of water until there was none left. It clattered to the ground with a most accusatory sound. "Go get more." "Why me? Send her." "You drank the last of it, you go." Patience dragged herself up and stumbled back outside. She made her way to the new cistern fixed to the side of the Lucy's house. With small, hobbling steps, she passed by the side of the house and peered into the window. No one was there. That was strange. She couldn't remember there being a time when no one was ever inside it. She reached the back of the house where the cistern towered over the roof. She stuck the pitcher underneath the spout and grabbed a hold of the handle, but before she could turn it, the hot metal scalded her. She jumped back, cursing to herself, shaking her burned hand, the pitcher rolling away in the dirt. Grabbing hold of the pitcher, she positioned herself back underneath the spout, using the tail of her skirt to protect her fingers. The spout seemed stuck. She grunted and heaved until it loosened, but nothing came out. It was completely dry. The heat sickness and the thirst were deliberate, part of the plan, we realized later. We awoke to Lizzie playing nurse, providing water and dabbing faces with a damp, cool cloth. She even sent Ollie out to empty the buckets of vomit, and one by one, she had Monroe carry Lulu, Patience, and Sarah back to the quarters. Where Isaac was, no one knew. For Junie, consciousness came and went, until finally she woke up on the cookhouse floor, dizzy and unsure of where she was or how she got there. All morning she had been a ball of worry, wondering when Lizzie would summon her to the house to ask for more of the tea or complain about having missed last night's dose entirely. Those were the scenarios she hoped for. What really worried her was the idea of the tangle of roots lying about somewhere in the Lucy's house. She bolted upright, but felt immediately pulled down by the fatigue of her body. She coughed, her throat dry. A blurry figure handed her a tin of water, only a quarter full. She gulped it down and held out the cup for more. The morning's dread surged back to her. She had to retrieve whatever Lizzie hadn't used. What if Nan or Sarah saw it? Or even worse, Harlow. He'd know exactly what it was. A trickle of water dribbled into the tin cup and stopped. She reached for the pitcher, but the hands holding it pulled it out of reach. Junie stared, trying to get her eyes to focus in the dim room. No, not until we talk. The figure's features slowly grew sharper. It was Lizzie, her limp hair uncombed, a ribbon askew, a strange, glassy look in her eyes, sitting at the small table in the corner. Junie sat up taller, trying to get her bearings. Dusk was falling, but there wasn't enough light to read whatever was flickering across Lizzie's face. Instead, she noted the weird angle of the woman's shoulders, the continuous bouncing of her right leg, almost independent of the foot connected to it. You make the tea? Junie asked slowly. No, but I will. Your blood come down yet? No, but it will. You don't seem worried. Well, it worked so well for you and the others. I need not fear, shall I? Lizzie said, her voice shaking. Panic rose in Junie's stomach. What you mean? Lizzie sighed. Don't insult me. Miss Lizzie, I don't know what you're talking about, Junie said slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. Lizzie tittered. Now I know you're lying. I can count on one hand how many times you have ever referred to me as such. I must really have your attention now. The two women looked at each other, unseeing. Clouds passed over, blocking what little light was left in the sky. Dark fell over the cabin, but neither woman moved for a long time, the air growing thick between them. How'd Miss Emmeline do? Junie ventured, a test question. Oh, she did just fine. Had a bitty baby boy. What in Hades we need with another one of those, huh? Lizzie said, laughing at her own joke. A strange cackle that bounced around the walls. How's your head? She said after a while. It hurts something awful, said Junie. Time seemed to be off kilter, warped by some strange dullness she felt clouding her mind, soddening her limbs. Lizzie struck a match. The men in town think this bitty old match can start a fire by its lonesome. Isn't that something? She said as she lit a candle. She sighed and offered Junie a scant bit of water. Here. Junie gulped it down and held out the cup. Is there more? The image of the well came back to her, covered over and barricaded. We couldn't get any from the well. Oh, just some foolishness with the patrol. Never mind all that. I want to talk about these twigs you gave me. Lizzie pulled out a bundle of cotton root from her dress pocket and dropped it on the table, causing the flame of the candle to flicker. Junie stiffened, the throbbing in her forehead spread out, a small vice tightening around her skull. Need me to boil it for you? Lizzie pulled free a short brown stalk and put it in her mouth. She began chewing, her eyes never moving from Junie's face. No, I want to know how long y'all been unsticking the pig, she said, her mouth half full. Is that what y'all call it? That is how you put it, remember? Can't the pig be unstuck? I haven't been able to get it out of my head since. Ma'am, Junie breathed. She knows. Lizzie chewed a minute longer, then blew the thick mass of cotton root out of her mouth. Bits of the chewed root flew into the air, onto the floor, onto her dress. My whole damn life you've been by my side. Like family, I'd tell anyone who asked. But maybe I was just blind to what you are, what you've always been. I don't know what you mean, Junie said quietly. She kept her body still while scanning the room. How many steps lay between her and the door? How far was the rack of pots and pans? Which one was closest, heaviest? Where were the hearth's poker and shovel? They were usually right there on the left side. Above the hearth, Junie could see an image forming. The same visual that had been playing in her mind ever since she first saw the steamboat tickets. A large boat barreling through dark gray water before stopping at a rickety port where her two children stood. I hate it when you pull that dumb slave act with me. It's insulting. Now, I'm giving you the chance to explain yourself. Most people in my position wouldn't be as generous. You know that. But then, you always have taken my kindness for weakness. You and Charles, two birds of a feather that way. What you asking me? Junie said, unable to keep the harsh edge from creeping into her voice. I want to know how long y'all been using the cotton root. Emmeline's midwife told me all about it, how y'all use it, and for what purpose. Junie felt her stomach seize up. She searched for an explanation just plausible enough to buy her more time to think, but her mind felt plodding and slow. Who? And before you play dumb, I should tell you I wrote to Mason this morning and told him we should talk seriously about the fate of your offspring. We could use them here, but maybe it's best he sell them. The markets in Louisiana are always hungry this time of year. The large visual on the wall began to darken in spots, as if it was suddenly splattered with a dark, viscous oil. Junie watched as the oil spread and congealed, until it seemed to soil everything. When she could no longer see the boat, no longer see Patrick's and Hannah's small faces, she turned to Lizzie. You want me to beg you? Is that what you want? Lizzie shook her head. What then? What we trading for? I want to know everything, Lizzie said, that glassy, desperate look appearing in her eyes again. And you'll do what? Right, Mason? Yes, I give you my word he won't sell them, but you have to tell me everything. Psh, I'd be a fool to believe anything that comes across your tongue. Well, that would make two fools then, because I've never lied to you, and you've been lying to me for God knows how long. I expect nothing less from the rest of them down there, but you? Lizzie stood up and began pacing. Just how long y'all been using it? 3 years? 5? The entire damn decade? She said, slamming a hanging pot down to the floor with a loud crash. Was this the day of judgment old folks back home used to sing about? Junie tried to remember the hymns, what guidance they offered, what peace, but there wasn't any. Just the sick feeling of oil on her stomach, on her tongue, the inky trail of that boat and her children sliding farther away into whatever plane they were fixed to. May they be protected. May they be safe. A cold steeliness came over Junie. Off and on we used it, whenever we needed to. Needed? Yeah, needed. Whenever the pig didn't want to be stuck. Like when somebody put a buck to you like you wasn't nothing but an old sow. I already told you that was Charles. You can't still be upset with me for that. A long pause filled the room, the sound of night pushing in, whirring mosquitoes and cricket songs, a dog howling in the distance. And you know what trouble I had breastfeeding, Lizzie went on. I needed help. If Charles went about it improperly, it's 'cause we were desperate. I was desperate. So were we. Lizzie stared at Junie, and Junie stared back, met the woman's eyes without shielding any emotion or thought inside her, for the first time she could remember. Lizzie blinked, averting her eyes as if struck. I'll advise Mason not to sell your children, but I can't save you from the lash. Not this time. Junie dragged herself to her feet and stepped into the doorway. That black oil seemed to be above her now, covering the sky. She looked for the moon, for the stars, but couldn't find them. She turned back to see Lizzie still watching her, the woman's mouth drawn into a thin, frozen line. Little sister, Junie sang, when have you ever saved me from anything? Junie stumbled down the steps, deeper into that dark, viscous night. She heard Lizzie behind her tumbling down the cookhouse steps. You ungrateful wretch, Lizzie yelled. By and by, you'll soon know what it feels like to go out into the world without my help. Chapter 31. They hailed from Henderson, Anderson, Freestone, and Ellis counties. They were boys, big and small, the youngest a scrappy 10-year-old, and the oldest just turned 17, a ragtag gang making its way to Navarro. They had been riding all summer, these boys, their number growing with the heat. At first, it had just been 3 or 4 farm boys from Henderson, ditching work to go to a hanging in Dallas, but one could say it started way before that. Back in their own counties, they each caught the bug. In the slow winter months leading up to that long hot summer, they had begun ditching school to go to any dust-up nearby, and each county had a few. Even before John Brown's execution in December, folks had been prickly. The old preacher's half-baked raid on Harper's Ferry was considered a joke, but the reaction to his death is what got stuck in white folks' craw. In 2 short months, Brown went from being a certifiable loon and laughingstock to a saint and martyr now that he was on the verge of execution. Had people all over the North singing his praises, over his mettle, his holy conviction, his willingness to die for abolition. The day he was hanged by the state of Virginia, Northwood church bells were rung in his honor, guns set off in precarious salute, and preachers ministered to solemn congregations. The feeling in the North seemed to be that Brown had been crucified. The line from then on was clearly set. Anyone who didn't boldly declare slavery a blessing was an enemy. Anybody from the North was suspect, likely to be a John Brown copycat, or an emissary of abolitionist causes. When the Chapel Hill Committee gathered outside the yard of Old Man Willis, seen talking behind closed doors with Negroes, the boys were there. They were among the crowd when the man was served his walking papers and run out of town. They were there, in Marshall, when a minister accused of being an abolitionist was charged with treason and barely escaped with his life. That one was a sight to see. When the mob pursued the minister and his family and finally caught up with them 12 miles from town, the boys were among the procession that walked the man to the jailhouse. Some of the bigger boys pushed into the middle of the fray and got to lay hands on the preacher, got to pinch his arm and punch him in the back before he was stripped, whipped, and robbed, before being locked away in the calaboose. For weeks afterward, the boys bragged about it in class, or on the farm, to all the boys who hadn't been there, whose mothers had managed to keep them home. They rubbed it in, all the fun they'd had, and how they couldn't wait for the next one. They were not disappointed. Come spring, there were more events to go to, and the boys blew off school, blew off chores, to travel in rollicking packs to the site of one great affair or another. In May, they rode all the way to Fannin to see the hangings of Emma, Reuben, and Jess, 3 slaves hanged for killing their master. The boys outshouted men twice their size in the tussle for souvenirs, a scrap of a shirt or dress, an ear, or a finger. These mementos would go in the small metal box they carried with them the entirety of that summer. And once the fires began in July, they didn't even bother going home. They traveled as far as Fort Worth to see another accused abolitionist tarred and hanged, and then back to Dallas, where they camped out the night before an execution to secure a good place in the clearing. That morning, the boys feasted on biscuits and ham, drank bitter coffee, and passed around a bit of whiskey, and were woozy with heat and drink by the time Patrick, Sam, and Cato were hanged, the 3 slaves the Dallas County mob identified as ringleaders of the fires that scorched and decimated the downtown area. Newspapers warned Texans of a large, detailed plot of insurrection scheduled to happen on Election Day in August. All-out war was on the horizon, one editor wrote, detailing a vast conspiracy of Northern abolitionists who had planted emissaries all over the South, who were working in concert with black people. Local papers reported of nearby towns being burned to a crisp, mobs discovering stockpiles of guns and strychnine in slave cabins, interrogations ferreting out hit lists of prominent citizens, and more lurid details of the unseemly plot. That day, while the men were out voting, black men would poison their wells and take their wives, and the murderous few would lie in wait to slaughter the husbands once they returned home. As hysteria increased, the boys' attentions grew scattered. It was hard to know which events would turn into the large festive parades of the early part of the summer. They could always ride with the local patrol and see what turned up, as it wasn't unlikely for a raid to turn into a small, quiet hanging now and then. But those events happened suddenly and rarely made the papers, And often, by the time word spread of such a hanging in progress, the boys didn't reach the site until it was all over. Sometimes, they could still grab hold of something for the souvenir box, but it just wasn't the same if they didn't see it with their own eyes. And that created another issue. With the boys being spread so thin, they fought over the box more and more. Who got to keep it and for how long? It got so the boys didn't even want to share what they obtained with the rest of the group. By the time they heard about an event in Navarro, it was tacitly understood that any boy who wanted a souvenir would have to secure it himself. That morning, they got on the road at first light in hopes they'd get a good spot before the festivities happened around noon. When the loom went up in flames, we didn't wait to be questioned. Some of us tried to disappear, but there was nowhere to disappear to. The woods were scorched and barren, most of the trees undressed, as if in the midst of a harsh northern winter. The creek was a memory, dry as bone. The patrols were everywhere. One of their numbers seemed to be posted every 100 yards. We wondered if these white men even pretended to work anymore, if they had livestock to tend to, crops to water. We knew about Dallas and Pilot Point and Denton. We knew they'd look to us and ask about the origin of the loom fire, but only one answer would be accepted. Monroe made his claim early. He zipped around, helping Mr. Lucy put the fire out, kept it from spreading, in hopes that his presence would alleviate any question of guilt. A foolish strategy, we thought, but it seemed to work. They only looked at us. They only sought us. And when they caught and pinned us all, we saw Mrs. Lucy up ahead, her face a hot red streak, her mouth a twisted spoon. I know it was them. Those wenches had been plotting against me since creation. Any other time, we might have been tickled by her turn of phrase, to hear her channel us this way, but the horrible men surrounding us, their wide faces and grubby roaming hands, made it hard to hear clearly. Without them, maybe we would have realized what she was saying, what she believed was the true crime, the fire itself merely a ruse of her own making. We were harried and confused, while Junie stood still as the trees, locking her eyes on Lizzie. Lizzie stared back, her face flushed. She pointed a crooked finger at Junie. No, just her. She's the ringleader. The men seized Junie first, before tightening their grip on the rest of us. She the ringleader? They asked us. Some of us shook our heads no, others remained frozen. Just what I thought, one of the men sniffed. He pushed his face close to Patience's. You look like the ringleader to me. No, I think it's the old woman, another man answered. I said I'm dealing with the rest of them. Just take her, Lizzie screeched. Now, ma'am, the Navarro Vigilance Committee has the authority to handle these threats as we see fit, a red-headed man said. We're taking these wenches to jail. If Charles wants to file a motion, he can do so down there. The vice around us tightened. We fought, but there were many. A loud gunshot startled us all. One round, then two. We all turned and saw Harlow firing into the sky. He lowered his revolver and moved slowly toward us. Paul, you son of a bitch, release my property, he yelled. Now, goddammit, or this next ball will be in your throat. You too, Wendell. Several of the committee men raised their rifles in Harlow's direction. You step back, a bearded man barked. You don't like it? You take it up with the council. Yep, you agreed just like everybody else, Harlow. Arsonists will be dealt with, no matter who they belong to, the red-headed man added. The bearded man moved close to Harlow until his rifle was inches from Harlow's chest. You hang back and collect yourself, the man said quietly, and once we're gone, you go see Reynolds. Charles, you bastard, screamed Lizzie. Are you just going to let them take everything? Shut it, Lizzie, he yelled back. The bearded man kept his rifle aimed at Harlow's chest while the rest of the men hauled us away. They took us to jail, with gleeful words on their lips. We heard ourselves condemned, damned, however one considers going over. This felt different. Who among us hadn't considered self-destruction? Who hadn't washed clothes at the edge of a river and one day found herself walking deeper and deeper into the throat of it? Who hadn't considered the bottom of a well or any of the other numerous possibilities that might present themselves in a single day? On the way to the jail, Sarah was separated from us. Her pregnant belly deemed her capable of being reformed, and if not reformed, then just valuable enough to be spared. Inside the calaboose, some women tried bargaining with the guard, how they could pick more cotton or drive a plow better than any full hand in the county. They were super women, they promised. If their lives were spared, they could do it all. Split rails, have babies, pick 100 bushels by their lonesome, and cook up a fantastic, plentiful meal with nothing but corn, lard, and whatever scraps one could muster. Junie may have been the only one who didn't bother with any of the above strategies. All her energy was set upon one thing, speaking to her children on this plane. And if it went the way it appeared to be going, maybe at the critical moment, she could fling herself beyond. Her soul could leap toward Georgia and bypass the other world altogether. The march from the jail to the site couldn't have been more than half a mile, but it felt much longer. The sun was high, its furious glare singeing our skin. We walked single file, bounded together by the wrists, past a graveyard of desiccated trees, out to where a large oak towered above. A cheer went up in the crowd, a sweaty mass of pink swollen faces. They taunted and heckled us. Together we sang, I know moonrise, I know starrise, I'll lie in the grave and stretch out my arms, lay this body down. 2 limbs of the tree were already roped, made to do the crowd's bidding. Those of us who could talk to trees tried to reason with it, accuse it of complicity. I'll lie in the grave and stretch out my arms, lay this body down. Past those horrible faces, there was a high fluttering in the trees north of us. The dry branches clacked, the dead leaves rustled. Our song now stuck in their boughs. I go to the judgment in the evening of the day, when I lay this body down. Shut up that racket. They singing in code. The song rose higher. And my soul and your soul will meet in the day, when I lay this body down. Junie, Lulu, Patience, Nan, each one adding to the song. The melody then breaks, breaking open, rising higher, before adhering itself to the slow movement of clouds passing over. 2 of the boys secured souvenirs, which included a scrap of Junie's gingham trousers, a lock of Patience's braid, and 1 toe, but from which woman they cannot remember. Come September, After the hysteria has died out, a couple of newspapers will run retractions, noting fires reported that never actually happened, wells declared poisoned that were in fact untainted, and substances thought to be strychnine that turned out to be harmless. Some people will begin to wonder if there was ever a plot of insurrection at all. The box of souvenirs will then lose its luster and later be forgotten about when Texas joins South Carolina and the rest of the South in the call for secession. Sarah could hear the women's song from the yard of the auction house, where she remained alone. The small building was only a few paces from the jail, as people were often moved between the two structures. From where she paced, she tried her best to ignore the lower half of her body, cramping in pain, and focused on the sound of the song starting up, then stopping, taken up by the next pair of women, until there was no song at all. She squatted in the dirt and was surprised that the baby slipped out easy, as if it had been waiting on her to just stop pacing long enough for it to descend. The child was alive, a wrinkled baby girl, not much bigger than her hand. She cleared its mouth, as she had seen Nan do, and the baby began to cry. She ripped off a portion of her skirt and wrapped the baby inside it. Something else was coming. With the child in one arm, she squatted and watched the slimy afterbirth fall into the dirt. She searched around for something to wrap it in. She didn't want her child to be anchored here, not in the yard of a trader's house or in Navarro County itself. She wanted no link between her family line and this terrible place. She let it dry out in the sun. The husk of the thing would have to go with them. She had nothing to cut the cord, and it seemed most reasonable to her to never cut it, to never be more than an arm's length from each other. A decade or so later, when Sarah will give birth for the third and final time, in the white clapboard house she shares with her family, her oldest daughter, born in the trader's yard, will be the one person she wants bedside. Though the midwife will frown at the child's presence and send the little girl off to fetch one thing or another, Sarah will remain steadfast in this one request. Outside, Noah will pull the plow slow within earshot, tracking the rise and fall of sounds coming out of the small pulsing house. If it's a girl, he'll burn a piece of tobacco and indigo, and if a boy, tobacco and corn. When the pain thickens, Sarah will summon the little girl by her bedside once more and tighten her swollen fingers around the child's tiny hand. And it'll be hard to say which one is the anchor affixing them to this new world, lest they be suddenly wrenched back into the old one. Back in the trader's yard, the newborn hollers, taking up the women's dirge. Sarah can hear the women singing again, a chorus embedded inside the baby's sharp cries.